Hi, everyone. I'm Shannon Gilmore. I'm the Executive Director of the Lincoln County Historical Association, and I'm so happy to be welcoming you tonight. Excuse me. Thank you for taking the time to join us. This is the last of our 2023 winter lecture series. And yes, I know it's not winter anymore, but it's wicked cold outside, so it feels like winter. This talk tonight is entitled Enslavement in Maine, and our speaker is Vana Carmona. We're so glad to be offering this remotely because it brings us a wider audience than when we offer lectures in person. Many members of that audience are here now, and many others will be watching the video recording that I'll be sending out after the talk. You can expect that to arrive in your email within a week or so. I just need a little time to troubleshoot any technology issues before I have it posted online. So a little bit of housekeeping before we get going with this evening's event. Because there are so many people on this Zoom, it is important that everyone remains muted throughout. As questions arise, you are welcome to put them in the chat, and you'll find that chat box at the bottom of your screen. That arrow is in the wrong spot. There you go. That's where you'll find the chat box. I'll read questions to Vana at the end of the program, and we'll make time for a Q&A then. And now I am happy to introduce our speaker. Vana Carmona is the founder of the Prince Project, a database of about 2,000 people of color who lived in Maine prior to 1800. She began researching enslavement in Maine 8 years ago after she discovered several of her ancestral New England families enslaved people of color, and were also complicit in the slave trade itself. Because of her grandmother's interest in genealogy and history, she'd always known that she'd descended from a number of early New England settlers, but it was only recently she discovered the role they had played in enslaving kidnapped Africans. Vana's also given presentations on her work to various local historical societies and schools. She's a docent for several historic sites in the Portland area, including the Maine Historical Society and Spirits Alive at Eastern Cemetery, the oldest public burial ground in Portland, Maine. And it does have 2 sections of African-American graves. She's a graduate of Sarah Lawrence College and completed her Master's of Liberal Arts in Medieval History at California State University, Sacramento. She's got a lot of interesting things to share with us tonight. And without further ado, I will stop my screen share so that we can turn things over to her.
Thank you very much, Shannon. I appreciate that. Okay, let's go over to my screen. And there you are. So I am going to, here we are. And there's my contact information if anybody needs to get in touch with me at some point or has any questions, or maybe even has something that you'd like to add to the research that I've been doing. I do want you to know that I do always cite whoever has given me any particular information. So just getting ready here. Okay, so what I'm going to do tonight is to give you an introduction to slavery in Maine. Yes, it existed, and it actually was here way back in the early part of the 17th century. I'm going to be discussing people who've been kidnapped in Africa, brought here, sold. I like to talk about the individuals themselves. I'm going to talk about the kinds of lives they were forced to live, housing, the significance of marriage and family, status in the church, burial grounds, etc. And of course, I'm also going to discuss their enslavers. Now, my research focuses on 17th and 18th centuries. And then after that, if you're interested in anything in the 19th century or the 20th century, I have a lot of friends and researchers who would be able to help you with that and would be pleased to do so. So you ask yourself, how did this all begin? And it actually began in a cemetery. It was almost 9 years ago. I'm always saying 8 years, but I looked at the calendar, it's almost 9 years, that I was in the cemetery in Gorham looking for various ancestors and ran across this stone that had prints on it. And I had no idea who he was. You couldn't really read it very well. There was some commentary on there, but it wasn't really legible anymore. But I was able to find it immediately when I got home. And I was pretty stunned to realize that he had been enslaved by my family. So I really didn't know anything about this, and I was a little bit surprised that I didn't. I thought that I probably would have been told at some point, but I wasn't. And so that was kind of a real pivotal moment in my life. And I know that I'm not the only one. I grew up in Maine, in Portland, and I went to school here, and I went on and obviously got a pretty decent education, and I didn't know any of this stuff. So I felt kind of awkward about it initially, but I have learned that that is just simply because that's the way we were taught. So knowing that this history that we've been teaching is glorified history is only once we got here. And it completely ignored people of color, indigenous or African descent. And I know that my own family's actually helped write that history. And so I feel that my role is to rewrite that narrative. So as I set out to find out more about this man himself and who else may have been enslaved by the family, and discovered there were several, I also got interested in, obviously it expanded, it grew, and pretty soon I was researching the entire state of Maine. I thought initially, well, I may find a few dozen people. It never dawned on me that I would be really reaching 2,000 at this point. And so I set the limit of the year 1800, because otherwise it was just going to be too overwhelming. When I first started my research, though, I wanted to say that I got a lot of negative reactions. And a lot of people did not want to believe it, didn't believe it, insisted that it wasn't true. And I even read, in fact, very recently I read some comments to an article that appeared here in Maine, and there are still people who don't believe it. And we know, at least those of us that are here tonight, we all know this is untrue. A lot of times the next thing I would hear is that these weren't slaves, they were servants. Well, this seems to be another way for us to deny enslavement in our state. And I guess maybe it makes us a little bit more comfortable. But I don't know if anyone read the New York Times a few weeks ago. Henry Louis Gates Jr. was discussing in an article a woman named Mildred Louise Rutherford. And she was a descendant of several enslaving families, a very prominent white supremacist speaker and writer in the South after the Civil War, and lived actually into the 20th century. And he cites her as claiming, quote, "The Negroes of the South were never called slaves. They were, quote, well-fed, well-clothed, and well-housed." So you can see that this word servant was also a word that was for enslaved. So the idea that when I was told we didn't have slaves, we only had servants, this was sort of a common way of addressing what we were doing. And it was both in the South and the North. So when you're researching this kind of history in these early periods, don't be misled by the word servant. Dig a little deeper, because chances are there's a very good chance that that person was actually enslaved. The term was servant for life, as opposed to indentured servant, which has, of course, a finite time limit. So when you see the term wherever, in wills or whatever, that says, quote, Negro servant or Negro boy and girl, it does mean enslaved. It is chattel. They were not hired help. Now, you can also ask yourself, let's just say they were hired help. Where did you find them? You know, we did not have a significant local free Black community here in these centuries. No, they were coming up from the West Indies, and some of them occasionally directly from Africa. So, and then we were living in a society where you actually, why would you hire somebody when you could go down, sadly, to the local tavern where they're having a sale of these people, and all you have to do is feed them, clothe them, and you don't have to worry about, you can work them to death. They can't quit on you, they can't unionize. So actually our society made it easy for people to enslave people as opposed to hire them. Another typical response was to downplay slavery in the North because, quote, it wasn't like the South. I would hear that often. I would often hear that we were, quote, good to the people we were enslaving. We didn't treat them the way we treated them in the South. But you can also see from this quote that I just gave you from the New York Times that they also believed they were very good to these people who are not.
If I could interrupt, it's not, are you advancing the slides?
No, not yet, but I will.
Okay, I just wanted to check. I'm sorry to interrupt. Thank you.
No, that's perfectly fine. So anyway, people have, at least I'm very happy to say, have over the last few years started to recognize that there was enslavement in Maine. And I will give you the next slide, and there it is. I have to update this so often. And yes, I know Arundel's in the wrong place. I have been told that several times. I just updated this. So this is the head count I have for the people of color in Maine prior to 1800. Now, it was never ever in just 1 year. I mean, please don't be confused by that. This was over the period that I've been studying. So, and I also know that I do know that there's a real dearth of information, particularly in this period. So there's no real go-to. You know, you can go to census reports, tax records, church records, the local histories, pick through files in the libraries, but it is a very difficult, painstaking process. And you kind of find a lot of vague clues, and eventually you kind of try to stick them together and piece them together. But I do estimate that for every person I have found, that there must be at least one other person that I haven't found. Because if you think about it, if a person was, let's say, born into an enslaving family, grew up there, worked, possibly died young, there's no bill of sale, they're not mentioned in the enslaver's wills, there's no records. So how will you ever know that this person ever existed? They're just lost to history. But you keep trying. And also, I wanted to point out that not every person of color in Maine was enslaved. No, they weren't. There's some who were not. But you also have to know, and then some were enslaved and manumitted. And I have seen one researcher come to the conclusion that only about 5% of Black people in Maine were free. So remember that a free Black person in Maine had to have descended from an enslaved person. There were no Africans that simply said, oh, they've heard about this land of opportunity and got on the ships going out of Africa to come here so that they could possibly find this land of opportunity. That would never have happened. They would have been immediately tied up and taken to the auction block and sold. So the concept that if you were Black, you were enslaved meant that, and let's see how I can rephrase this. When I start reading some of these records, it will say if they're free, because that would have been unusual. If they had, with the majority of them had been free, then you would have said an enslaved person. So the fact that every once in a while you find someone referred to as free, that actually underlines and underscores that most of them were not. I hope that makes sense. But at the same time, I do agree that slavery in the North was different from the South. Not that it's acceptable anywhere. I've heard it referred to the Southern system as a slave. Is everything okay? Can you hear me okay? Okay. The Southern plantation version was a slave society. Slavery was essential to its very existence, economically, politically, and socially. Whereas here in the North, we had a society with slaves. It's different, it's not better. Although Maine's enslaved population did much to create the outcome of our lives here, we were not directly dependent on them economically for our survival, as in the cotton and sugar industries. Up here, they would be doing lots of the grunt work. It wasn't one specific task. They'd be chopping wood, caring for animals, cooking, cleaning, working on ships, taking care of children. They rarely had one job. So that actually allowed their enslavers to focus on the more visible work, like running the town, the shipping, and the shops, etc. So what that ended up doing is it put all the people of color, all the enslaved people, under the radar. And that's also what you see when you're reading historical accounts here in Maine. You don't see them. You don't see them because they're not on the radar. So, but people didn't have, it was very, very widespread. I found that in Portland, for instance, of the people that I know who were the enslavers, who were the elite of Portland, I would say a good 70% that I can count had enslaved people in their households. And that's what I can count, which makes me think that there were certainly a lot more. And this is really supported by a lot of accounts. So speaking of this, who were the worst offenders? Here's one, Sir William Pepperell. I would say he was probably had the most enslaved people in his household of anyone in Maine. And he was also, I know some of you probably know who he was. Sir William Pepperell was the first and the only American to be given the title of baronet. And he certainly took that to heart. He was known to dress his enslaved people up in elaborate uniforms and have them row him around on a barge in the river. He was in Kittery. So that everyone could see him. And it was some sort of form I always think of as some New England interpretation of European royalty. And also what was typical in the Pepperell family is it ran in generations. His father enslaved people, and so did his, well, it wasn't his son, it was his nephew, but who he essentially took on as his son. So this was very, very common, and we'll be seeing that again throughout the presentation. The other thing I want you to note here is this bill of sale. So on the side here, you see proof that Pepperell was not only complicit in enslaving people, he was complicit in the slave trade itself, and he was also bringing enslaved people into Maine. And that is what you're seeing here. There's 5 people that are referred to in this bill of sale, only one of them here. There's a woman here, says Negro woman. She has a Y branded on her shoulder. And she was brought into Kittery from Barbados in 1719. I also know that from other records that she's the only one that survived, and she actually passed away 3 weeks later. There were 4 other people in this shipment, and the other 4 had died at sea. Now, you're probably wondering, so when did all of this begin? Who were these early Mainers who were enslaving people kidnapped in Africa? And what was it like for them once they got here? Because you can try to imagine, here you are in Africa and you've gone through this horrible experience and been tied up down below like sardines. And finally you come to a country and you're sold, and it's someplace like Maine where you can imagine you don't speak any of the language, and there's like snow. So you can imagine how incomprehensible that must have been. But there were people of color who had come into Maine as early as the early 17th century. Was he enslaved? I don't know exactly. His name was Mateo da Costa, and he's a little bit problematic because he's known to be the first Black man to come into Canada. And there was evidence that he did cross over into Maine. And this was in 1608. So we're going to call him the first person of color to come into Maine. Then we go to, if we feel like, no, he wasn't it, then we can go back to 1633. And we have a man named Oliver Weeks. Now, again, he's another enigma because he was the quote unquote servant of George Cleves, Cleves and Tucker, two of the first European settlers to come into Portland. They were the first more permanent settlers that came into Portland. And yes, for those who do know him, I know that some say that maybe he wasn't Black. There are some records that he was. Why is there a conflict? Well, the conflict is because those that I know who feel he was white point to the fact that he had a last name, which is true. The majority of people of color in the 17th and 18th century did not, especially once they were really, slavery really took hold here in the form of, especially chattel slavery. But remember that he had come with Cleves and Tucker, so he had come from Europe. And the other thing that they had a different way of they had a different system of slavery there. And the other thing that people point out is that he testified against Cleves later in his life. And that is not actually evidence that he was white, because people of color were actually allowed to testify in court at that time, and even later. So there was a time when Black enslaved people did have some form of some rights. But these rules of slavery in the colonies became more rigid as time went on, and as we became more dependent on this type of labor to maintain our economies. So we evolved into a form of chattel slavery where slowly the enslaved person had essentially no rights at all. Now, that tipping point started in about 1641. Hold on just one second. And I think I just got a visitor here. Go on. My dog just joined me. Okay.
I'm under wash. Do you want to wash?
I'm sorry.
Hands?
Can you
Sorry,
hear?
I have it set so people shouldn't be able to unmute themselves, but somehow people are getting unmuted here and there, and I apologize for that
Oh,
interruption.
that's okay. I'll just carry on. Okay. So now we're at 1641. And that's when you're going to find this next reference to a Black man in Maine. And this is a man who was enslaved by Captain Thomas Cammock. And he was mentioned in a letter from Thomas Gorges to his uncle, Sir Ferdinando Gorges. And he wrote, in fact, I'm trying to see, I think I had a copy of that letter, but it seems to not be here right now. I don't know where it went. He wrote, your fourth letter speaks of instructions sent by Captain Cammock's servants. He hath but one come over, and it is a Negro. So this is in 1641. And this is really timely because that's exactly the time in 1641 that Massachusetts, and thus Maine, because we were a part of Massachusetts at the time, recognized slavery as a legal institution. It was codified. It actually had been an institution, but it hadn't been a legal institution. So at that time, Massachusetts Bay Colony enacted a law saying that, quote, there shall never be any bond slavery, villanage, or captivity among us unless, wait, here it goes, unless it be for lawful captives taken in just wars, and such strangers as willingly sell themselves or are sold to us. So that sums it up. And by the way, the man who helped write that was Governor John Winthrop, who was himself a slave owner. And it didn't take long for Connecticut and Plymouth to follow with similar laws. Excuse me, I'm really sorry, but I have to shut the door, let the dog go. Sorry about that, because I was hearing things down the hallway. So later on, when we get to this clip here, this was in 1673. And this was actually just a sentence, but that's sometimes all it takes. It was referring to a man, this was in John Joslin's diary. He was the man who later settled in Scarborough, but he was down in the Kennebunkport area, and he found that there was a man down there who used the buttocks of a black man who had drowned as fishing bait for the fish he caught and sold. So this is where you see this in the diary. This is saying, with which they speed not so well as the waggish lad at Cape Porpoise who baited his hooks with the drowned man Negro's buttocks. Not very flattering. Now here we have next, we have Susanna, and she was in Pemmiquid, so she was up your way. Her name was Susanna. We believe she arrived here before 1686, and that she was enslaved by Alexander Woodruff. He was from New York, and he came up to Maine to the new Pemmiquid settlement in 1686, and she would have been about 70 years old. Now, both of them left the area about 3 years later when the settlement was destroyed, and they moved back to the Boston area. So we don't know a lot about her life, but we do believe that she lived in the house with the Woodruffs, and that she may have been born in the United States, but probably not, because at that period, she probably had been born in Africa and brought over. And we find her at this time later on in 1736. She's actually given testimony against, it was actually in a deed. It was a deed dispute that she was involved in. And it says here, Susanna, a Negro woman aged about 70, because remember, this is 1736, testifieth and saith that she was servant to Mr. Alexander Woodruff at Pemmiquid about 50 years ago. So that's, some people consider that she is the first woman that actually came and lived here. I don't know. I still think the gentleman that drowned off the coast of Kennebunkport counts, and maybe even some of the others, like I'm drawing a blank all of a sudden, Oliver Weeks, etc., who had come in here, and Matteo, who had come in here before. But they came in, they didn't really stay that much. We don't know. Now what we're finding is, now later in the 17th century, we have several more who are listed. We're starting to see more often some records that talk about people of color living here. This one is Charles Frost. This is his will of 1694. And we have 3 that were listed here. He was in Kittery, and I'm going to see if you can see my cursor. We have Nicholas. Nicholas is down here, and he got Prince with my Negro boy named Prince. And then we have over here on the next page, his son Charles was given his Negro manservant Tony, but Tony first has to stay and be the servant to his widow, and then he would go to Charles. And then as you scroll down, you'll find down here, also I give to my said son 1 piece of gold, and as also a Negro boy named Esquire. So he had 3 right there. And it's kind of interesting because Tony crops up again. He crops up again in 1708 when he is with the son Charles. And this younger Frost actually frees him. And I don't have any idea why, but he did. He manumitted him, but he continued to enslave several other people, and some of those are actually listed on his will when he dies in 1724. Another one from the late 1600s is this one, Captain Francis Hook. This is actually kind of an interesting letter, because document actually, because his wife actually inherited these two enslaved people from an estate in Barbados. Now keep in mind that whatever a woman had actually belonged to her husband. So Captain Francis Hook is actually saying in this document that he acknowledges that these two Black people were inherited by his wife, and that he's saying they still belong to her. So he actually had to set up this document to say that they were actually hers. And then you'll find several years later in Francis Hook's will, you'll see that there, well, you won't see because you probably can't read this kind of stuff as well as I'm running into it all the time. I'm getting pretty good at it. But 9 years later, there were several, quote, Negroes, it's right in here, that he's leaving in his will of 1694. I don't know how many there are, but he left them to his wife, Mary. And then you'll see over on the right-hand side, again, the saga continues, that you have here, there was Hannah and Tony. And over here, when Mary Hook dies in 1706, you see Hannah is still there. It's part of her estate. Hannah's got a value of 25, whatever it was they were using at the time. And then underneath it, it says a mulatto boy about 2 years old. He's only worth a fraction of what I'm assuming it's his mother was worth. So you see these kinds of things, we're starting to find more and more documents. We'll find even John Wheelwright of Kittery. He passed away in 1700 and left Titus to his wife. And then of course there were the Pepperells and the many that we know that they had. And they were also left, he left so many to his wife that he actually said that she could pick, left so many in his estate that he actually told his wife in his will that she could pick 4 for herself. So we don't really know how many there actually were, but I have counted more in his household than anyone. So now we're going to go into the 18th century. And it's getting, it's easier and easier to find more records. But I'm not entirely sure that's because we can find more records or because there were more people. I kind of think that it's a little of both. I know that Portland, for example, then Falmouth, was finally by the 1720s was experiencing a lot more peace in the area because they had managed to make arrangements with the local indigenous population that had been living here for centuries, that they were essentially subjugated, and it was safer for people to move, for the Europeans to move back into the area and set up and start their European style society and businesses. And a lot of them that came up were not just looking for, well, they were looking for opportunities. They weren't coming up looking for land because they never had any. A lot of the people that were coming up from the Bostons and the Portsmouths actually were very well to do, and they were very much part of the elite. And they came up here to kind of expand on what they already had. And a lot of them brought enslaved people with them. They were enslaved in their households in Massachusetts or New Hampshire. Maybe they came through dowries, or they inherited them, or they simply purchased them from people that they knew. And so they were not climbing the social ladder, they were already there. So in the Portland area, for me, it was great because all of these people were buried in Eastern Cemetery, where I am a docent. And that was established in 1668 as the public burial ground. So they're all there. They're all concentrated in this area. And so I got to know all of them very well. And if, by the way, if anyone is coming into the Portland area and would like to see some of the graves of these enslavers and visit the 2 sections of African-American sections, I'd be happy to help you with that. I would say that one of the people that really, to me, is, I call him the poster child of this movement, would be Moses Pearson. And here's a picture of his stone, which is a gorgeous stone in Eastern Cemetery. And you will see here, this is the epitaph that's on it, but I just wanted you to note this, this part here. He had come to Portland in the 1720s, and one of his claims to fame was that he was one of the leaders in the Battle of Louisburg in King George's War in 1745. Oh, and by the way, he was under the command of Sir William Pepperell, who was there also with one of his enslaved men named Cato. So after the battle, Moses Pearson, along with another captain who was with him, petitioned for a land grant. And in 1750, he was granted a large tract of land outside of town, which was named Pearson Town in his honor. And today that town is known as Standish, Maine. So here's his graveyard, his gravestone. He says, having lived an exemplary and useful life, and served his country to acceptance in a variety of offices, civil and military, his works of piety and love remain before the Lord. Honor on earth and joys above shall be his pure reward. Well, that's wonderful, but it tells what a wonderful man he was and how he had done all these great things, but it doesn't talk about the fact that he was a slave owner. Now, this information you have to dig for because the traditional narrative is on the stone. Now, what you will find, it isn't much, but it counts. Right here, you will see Thomas Shute was a tailor. He had an accounting record here for Moses Pearson. And if you look, you'll see here that he made for your, hold on, it's really here, right here. We have making for your Negro a pair of breeches. And up here we have one where he was making, he also had an Indian boy right here. An Indian boy, I don't know how old he was. I'm going to guess he was probably maybe into his early teens. He got a jacket. That's it. That's all we know. Later on, I think it was 9 years later, I found a transcript of this bill of sale. He was down in Boston and he paid 150 old tenor for a woman named Rose. And so she came up and she was enslaved by him for quite a while, in fact, because you will find a few years later, in 1759, he purchased a man named Scipio, and he bought him from James Noyes in Newburyport, Massachusetts. Now, you'll also, if you lived in Portland or spent any time around here, some of these names are going to sound really familiar. Noyes, Montfort, there's streets named for them. So now what I did find, which is kind of interesting, is then in 1772, check this out, July 30th, Scipio and Rose were actually allowed to marry. They were married by Reverend Samuel Dean, who was at the First Parish Church. After that, I have no idea what happened to them. So you can see how easy it is to find out information about the lives of enslavers, at least the parts that we're supposed to know. But if you really want to find, you can go to their historic houses sometimes, go to museums, you can find lots of things in the cemetery, in the churches, etc. But you don't, how did the people that they enslaved actually live? So, for example, where did Moses Pearson's enslaved people live? Well, we didn't have a plantation system, so there were not the long rows of dilapidated cabins that you envision located on the property. So they actually tended to live in the houses with their enslavers, because rarely, except in the case of a few people like Sir William Pepperell, most people didn't have more than maybe 1, 2, or 3 people. So it was easy to have them just, you didn't need a separate residential community for them. So you would fix up your attic or something like that. So here's a couple of examples just locally here in the Portland area. This one is the Waldo Dole House, which is in Stroudwater. Francis Waldo sold it to Daniel Doyle in the 1770s. And we do have records that up in the attic, there was a section that was built off that had a fireplace, and that is where he kept his enslaved people. And interestingly enough, Daniel Dole, who bought the house, who was also an enslaver and probably used the same system for their living in the house, he is actually Moses Pearson's son-in-law. So once again, you're seeing how enslavers tended to have children who actually continued this so-called horrible tradition. I do know that Daniel Dole enslaved a man named London, for example. And then just down the street is the Tate House Museum, which you can visit. This is the attic up there. You can't normally go up into the attic because of fire restrictions, but sometimes if you can, there are special tours that can take you up there. So this is where the enslaved people of George Tate would be living. There's a couple of little rooms up there. One of them does have a fireplace. So, and then they could go straight down the stairs and into the kitchen. And those are just two houses that were just a hop, skip, and a jump from each other. Now, we also know that Rose and Scipio were married in 1772. So obviously you say, well, gee, they get to marry and have families. Well, it wasn't that easy, actually, because first of all, you had to have the permission of your enslavers. You couldn't just get married because you wanted to. And here I have yet another. Prince and Ruth, they got married. I have this announcement here, or actually it wasn't an announcement so much as just simply a recording at the town clerk. Prince was a Negro manservant of Robert Dabney, and Ruth was the servant of James Gooding. They were both in Portland, and they were allowed to marry in 1737. But it's really important to know that that does not necessarily mean they got to live together. Okay, they actually probably didn't. Most people, Prince would continue to live with the Dabneys and Ruth would continue to live with the Goodings, and they would see each other whenever they could. Luckily, they lived in the same town, so maybe they could make more arrangements that way. So, but I've also found in my research this incredible letter, and this was out of Scarborough, just to give you an idea of what it took to be able to get married at this time if you were enslaved. Because remember, you don't have any rights now, they're gone. So here we are, we have Boston and Hannah. This is their marriage agreement by Richard Elvins and the Reverend Elvins and Richard King, who were in Scarborough. And if you read some of this, it says that they're allowing their slaves to get married, and by their incredible generosity, they're making an arrangement that they will never have to live more than one parish apart. So that does quite sum it up. And it sounds like they feel like they're being very generous. But there's something else here. This didn't necessarily mean that they had to keep them all their lives. They could also be sold. There was nothing to say that they couldn't sell them just because they were married and just because they were living in the same parish. There's nothing to say that. And what about their children? The children automatically belonged to the enslaver of the mother. So, and of course that made it very convenient, especially if some of those children actually happened to be the enslaver's children himself. But they could always be sold off. And I've also encountered where if, let's say, an enslaved person marries a free person, and that can get really complicated because theoretically or legally, the free person could then be automatically enslaved by the spouse's slave owner. But I have seen one incident where it really wasn't applied, but it could. And those that it did, it created some real horror stories. So family and marriage did not have the same meaning or protection for enslaved people at all. They had no legal rights. So everything, including marriage, children, etc., was all at the convenience of the enslavers. I'm going to skip down now to Okay. So this now brings us to the question of church and religion, which of course is probably one of the most complicated aspects of all of this. Church records are great resources for resources for researchers. You have marriage, baptisms, births, and deaths are often recorded, and that's great because these are really elusive primary sources. So why, you might be asking, were enslaved people brought into the church in the first place to be married as well as baptized and converted if they had no rights? And that's a question that nags so many of us, no matter how much research we do. How do people who believe in democracy, who believe in freedom, and are members of religions that are supposed to care about other people, go out and kidnap and enslave other human beings? It doesn't make a lot of sense. You know, in order to be a colonizer, but here's the catch, in order to be a colonizer, you have to believe somehow that the people you are colonizing are inferior. You can't enslave your peers, you can't colonize your equals. So I see it time and time again that European colonizers saw these people from African societies as, and they'll say it out loud in some of the books, infantile, simple, needing guidance. You'll see it right into the local historical accounts that were written and so popular in the mid-19th century. You'll see that every time you see an account, if you're reading some of these local historical books, you'll see an account of a Black person. You'll always see that person's always speaking in some sort of strange dialect, even if that person were born and raised here. The stories that are selected about these individuals are almost always told in a way that makes them seem like different or not so bright as their white neighbors. And some of these books I've found are just outright racist, and you're just shocked that they could even be published. So obviously it was universally accepted, or they couldn't have been published with this kind of wording. So religion was one method that was actually used to undermine the cultures of people in question, and and once you take that away from people and start changing, it makes these people more dependent on their colonizers. I hope that makes sense. It's not easy to explain, and I'm sure it's uncomfortable for a lot of people. So to dominate someone, it's easier if you can take away everything that's familiar. You can take away from their family, their country, their environment, their cultures, change their names, and undermine their spiritual beliefs. So European colonizers in turn justified this behavior by seeing themselves as saviors. And you will see this over and over again in the research. They felt they were at a moral obligation, that they were doing a good thing. So one interpretation I read recently was that converting these people to the colonizers' religion didn't make the enslaved people better people, but it sure made them better slaves, because it was teaching them that your reward is going to come later. Now, of course, once they were part of the Christian churches, once they were in the church, then all of a sudden, were they part of the church? No, they had separate sections. And I have fellow researchers down in Kennebunk, for instance, who've been doing studies on a church there. And there was a section constructed specifically for the people of color. They had to go up a ladder to a segregated area, and that area could not even be seen from the rest of the congregation. Nobody could even know they were there unless you simply knew that they were there. And when they died, what happened? You didn't get down, you got down to the cemetery, but you had the Black section. And you'll see, for example, here's one, this is the lower Black section in Eastern Cemetery. Now you don't see a lot of gravestones because they've been, first of all, a lot of the stones there for the people of color would have probably been fieldstone or wood and didn't survive. And also vandals have completely taken out a tremendous part of this to make it even harder. So hold on, it looks like we're going to be running out of time soon. Then there's another section when they added the back section of the cemetery, which because this older section was so chucker block full, they had another section, again, as far away from the gate as you could possibly get it. This section you're looking in, you went in the original gate and you walked way to the right as far as you could go. Then they added the back section, way to the back as far as you could go. So it's a very, very complicated topic, and I'm always open to discussions and debates about that. But as you can see, in essence, as we've gathered, slavery was at the convenience of the enslavers. And of course, we're talking about chattel slavery here. So on the one hand, you're human enough to be encouraged to join the church and convert, be baptized. And on the other hand, you were non-human enough to be listed as pure property in the wills of your enslavers. And I think we've got one here. Here's William Pepperell. Here's the one I was talking to you about earlier. I give and bequeath unto Mary, my beloved wife, the income, etc., etc. And then I also give her any 4 of my Negroes, which of them she shall choose. Okay, so and here we are. We see this over and over again. We see probate records where people, you saw the one with Hannah and the little 2-year-old boy, that they are simply listed right there with the cattle, with the furniture, with the clothing, and the kitchen equipment, and they're given a price. And yet here they are. They have joined the church. They've worked to make the society that we live in here in Maine. And yet at the end of the day, they're dispensed with a monetary value. So it's really it's just hard. It's hard to get your head around that. Now we're going to go on to, so when did slavery actually end here? And I think there were several, in my opinion, there were several events that led up to the official end of slavery in Maine, and one was the Revolutionary War. And this was an opportunity for many enslaved people to go and fight. And the arrangement is that they were fighting for their freedom as well. Most of them had to make arrangements with their owners to go. Some of them went with a blessing of their enslavers. Some went anyway. And some, I know in my own family, one was allowed, a man named Plato, who was basically said, yes, go. And then Prince himself, his enslaver, William McClellan, did not want him to go, but he went anyway. And then there's some like, there was a man named Romeo who was enslaved by Reverend Thomas Smith, who started the First Parish Church here. And he made an arrangement that he could go and fight, but he had to give Reverend Smith half his wages. So that was actually, if you know anything lately about Reverend Thomas Smith, it's not a surprise. He was the same man who started a church, absolutely, but at the same time, he provided assistance to local people to go out and hunt down and murder some of the Native Americans in the area, because there was a bounty on their scalps and they had to share the bounty with him. And that supplemented his income substantially. So the fact that he made Romeo give him half his wages to fight in the Revolutionary War for us, that makes sense. What they didn't know at the time is that by 1783, they were all going to be freed anyway, because that is when Massachusetts, of which we were a part, they had a new constitution, and they put in it that all men were free. And immediately people started to take issue with that. There was a woman named Mumbet, who later became known as Elizabeth Freeman, and there was a man named Quock Walker, and they were able to get legal assistance and fought that. And finally, Massachusetts said, you know, you're right. So we can't really have slavery here. But I never say that it was abolition, because it really wasn't. It was simply that legal enslavement was discontinued. So you couldn't go in and say, hey, I have this bill of sale, this man belongs to me. You can't do that because it wouldn't be supported. So it's simply, you had to come up with another system. So yes, these people were now free, but unfortunately, the culture of slavery, as I call it, continued. Most of these people continued to stay and work for the people they always had and live in the situation they always had. It's almost like they went from being enslaved to being serfs. They went back, did the same darn thing, and they had the similar situation, except they did have the right to leave if they so wanted to. So if you look at the census of 1790, the first real census that we have, you'll see that there are a lot of people of color that are still living in homes of white families. You did see a few Black independent households, but not very many. And this is 7 years after they had gotten their freedom. And in this time, you'll see these horrible things. Like there was a woman in Bristol who was not allowed to come home until she found the cows, and she froze to death. And she was theoretically free. So a lot of them came back to the families and where they had lived. And one of the things you will see is that they're always, especially when you're reading those 19th century local histories, is that, oh, so-and-so came back and his former owner was so happy to have him, gave him a house, gave him land, and all of that. And quite frankly, I have not found those deeds. So they went back into the same situation that they had before, except that they were legally free. And I know that we don't have time because we're running out of time, but I did find a deed recently and it supported 100%. Yeah, he got a deed 30 years later. Okay. And he had to pay for it. But if anyone wants to know anything more about that, I'm happy to talk about that one. So anyway, my family did this too. My family gave land to their formerly enslaved people, but I know my family and they don't give away property, not at all. So it sounds great. It sounds generous. But by 1800 comes around and you're really starting to see it take off. You're starting to see many, many, many more independent Black households moving throughout the state. So things are finally starting to change. But that's 1800. I'm into the 19th century. So someone else will have to take over that chapter. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vana. I'm
You're
sure
very
everyone
welcome.
is clapping. That was really,
Here.
really interesting. Do you
So
have
there's
some question? Oh, you're still closing. Go ahead.
Well, no, I'm just saying in closing, there's my contact information. And I know that we're running out of time and I'm sorry that I went over. I don't know how, because I did have this timed. I did put together, as I said earlier, I put together a list of my Lincoln County enslavers and enslaved people, and it's pretty substantial, guys. So, we can talk about that another time, or you can get in touch with me about it. But there were quite a few. Do we have some questions?
Everyone is invited to reach out. Do you have time for a few questions?
Oh, absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay, wonderful. Great. Let's see. So there are actually a number of questions that have come in. I'm just going to try to comb through them. Did you ever find unexpected family connections between the enslaved people you were researching, or unexpected social connections? Like you mentioned a couple of marriages. The question also goes on to ask, might any of those questions show enslaved people trying to build communities?
Oh, I think they build communities. There are some places where there actually were a lot of, well, we have Malaga Island, of course, there was that. I would say around Brunswick, there were several families that ended up intermarrying and then actually moved inland as they were able to do so later. In Portland, absolutely. Kittery, absolutely. I'll take a quick glance down through here and see if I've got, there were, as soon as you had an enslaver who had quite a number of enslaved people, then you would find communities start to get established. So that would be taking a quick look here, Dresden, Waldoboro, Wiscasset, heaven's sakes. Well, you know why Wiscasset? Because you got the shipbuilding and you've got the shipping. And the minute you have shipping, you have everyone's complicit. If you're taking wood and your garbage fish down to the West Indies, the garbage fish is of course to feed the enslaved people, and then you're automatically entrenched in that kind of economy. And that's how we ended up, everyone who was up here in Maine, the vast majority of them were wealthy were shipping, and the shipping was complicit with the slave trade, either directly or indirectly, either through the products that you were taking and trading or through the actual human beings themselves. So
I'm from Maine too, Vana, and I think that growing up in Maine, I got the strong impression that, you know, slavery was something that happened in other places.
I know.
Right. And we really talked a lot about our shipping heritage, but it took a really long time for me to put those pieces together. And now you realize it's right there in front of you, right?
Oh, I totally agree, because when I first started 8-9 years ago on this project, that still hadn't completely sunk in. But it did. It filtered through over the years, and then then I would say, well, some of them aren't, and then it's pretty clear. If you were involved in shipping, you were involved, and because that was a real strong point for our economy. Think about our entire society here was built on the enslaved labor somewhere else. So.
Thank you. I'm sorry, the questions are pouring in faster than I can keep
Go
up
ahead.
with.
I'll do my best. Go ahead.
Okay, here's Lisa says, I'm a direct descendant of Tobias Hill, a Black patriot of Georgetown. We are aware his family was enslaved by Samuel Denny, but we're trying to figure out where they came from. Do you happen to have any research on the Hills of Georgetown and Brunswick who eventually moved to Portland and where they may have come from?
I don't know where they originally came from, but I am very, very familiar with the Hill Griffin families that intermarried. Absolutely. But where they came from in terms that you're talking about, in terms of where they came from the West Indies or where they came from in Africa? Is there?
It's just saying where they came from in general.
I'm going to say that they probably came from Africa to the West Indies and then up to Maine. We did have some people that did come directly in from Africa. I don't think we didn't, but we tended to trade more with the West Indies, so they would come in there first. The vast majority, not all, okay, the vast majority of people from African descent in New England came more from West Africa. I'm saying Senegal, Ghana, Sierra Leone, and also down into Nigeria. But that is not, I'm not saying that's the only places. I also know that there were some that actually came in all the way from Madagascar. So, which is, I don't know if you're familiar with the geography, but there's Africa, you go all the way down the Horn and you're heading up the other side like you're going to go to India, and there's a huge island there, and that's Madagascar. So it was also coming from there. I do have evidence of that, sadly.
That's kind of a good reminder. Africa is enormous. We always say, you know, people might have come from Africa, but that means,
oh yeah, no,
you know,
actually,
very
the vast
vague.
majority did come in, and if anyone wants to talk about African history, I'd like to do that too. They would be kidnapped very often by other Africans, taken down to the coast. And there were places like depots, castles, and prisons where they would be imprisoned until they could get them onto the ships. That was the standard operating procedure. And a lot of those depots are still in existence, and I'm actually planning to go to visit some of those this fall. If anyone wants to go with me, let me know.
Okay, I'll come.
Okay.
A couple of questions are very specific here, and I'm going to try to combine them and let you answer however you like. But there's one question asking about the Pushards of Dresden and whether they're on your list of enslavers. There's a question about Isaac Royal of Topsham. And then the next question that I think ties into both of those is, do you have any advice for people trying to trace their own family's history of enslaving? Okay. So that is a three-part question, but I thought they went together.
The first one was, give me the first one.
The Pushards of Dresden.
Dresden. Oh, I've got lots of Dresden people here. But if I'm missing somebody, oh, please let me know. Because I want to make sure I get them all. Bowmans, Goodwins, Lovejoys. Yes, we should send that one to me. We'll see if we can track them down.
Okay, I lost track of who asked that question, but if you have some information on the
Yes,
push
I would love that.
Email
Please
Vanna.
do.
Yeah.
Absolutely. We'll see what we can do on that. And what was the second one? I heard
Isaac
Royal.
Royal, a landowner.
Oh, they
in
were
Topsail.
awful. Yeah, the Royals. They were mostly in the Yarmouth area, Yarmouth and North Yarmouth area. North Yarmouth was kind of a hotbed of enslavers. And they were enslaving, and then they went down. I'm trying to remember the story. Hold on. They went down, and one of them went down into Massachusetts and set up this enormous estate, which is now, I know it's a house museum that you can visit, and they've been very, very good about confronting their history. So they were big time. And who was the next one? What was the next part?
The next question was, what do you have for advice for folks who are wanting to look into their own family's histories?
Oh, well, let's start. If your family history, if you think that you're related, that you have ancestors that were enslaved, you can start by just, of course, tracing back your genealogy till you find them. I will say that when you're in the 19th century, you're going to have a lot better luck. When you get into the 18th century, it's going to get pretty dicey. But there are some records, and if I do, sometimes I've had to sit down because it got so complicated and sketch out sort of a genealogical, a family tree of some of these enslaved families, because it did get complicated. So I'm always happy to help. Depending on what the family is, there are some people that have done some enormous research on their families. I know, like Bob Green, for instance.
I think this question actually is asking about families of enslavers.
Enslavers, okay.
Like I don't mind saying for myself, I did some research and discovered that I was related to some enslavers, but I think that there are at least two people here who are looking to do some of their own research.
Okay.
And wondering where you might send them for records like wills, church records, etc.
Wills, you can go to, well, some of the stuff you can find online. Maine wills, Maine probate records, a lot of those you can find online. That's very, very helpful. There's also databases like slave voyages where you can start to maybe, but that gets tricky because often somebody that owns the ship might not be listed on that. I've had that happen. I'll go, oh, I know this guy had tons of ships, but you look and I'm only finding the captain. Now someone might be the captain of the ship, but he might not own the ship. So if you find any indication at all that they were shipping merchants, then you can pretty much rest assured. Then you can start to try to find some of the voyages, and that is becoming easier to do. You can try slave voyages, the database. You can also try some of the local historical societies, sometimes have a lot of that stuff that may not even be up yet that's searchable. So that would be the first thing I would look for, would be if they're shipping merchants. Wills and probates, you can do a pretty good job on that. After that, church records, a lot of those you can find online, maybe not all, but some, but that should at least get you started. Census, but remember that's 1790. So it gets a little bit more difficult because theoretically they're not enslaved and they're not listed as enslaved. They're listed as other free people.
Oh, interesting.
You got white men, you got the white men, you got the white women, and then you got the others. And then over there's a couple more columns and it says slaves, but they're not slaves. Although once in a while you'll find someone that was obviously hadn't gotten the memo and did check off slave, but you don't see that too often because they weren't.
Great, that's helpful. Yeah. One of the questions here from somebody who is interested in how you did your research noticed that, let's see, in your marriage of a woman named Ruth, it did not indicate next to her name that she was Black. And they noticed the same thing in the record you showed of the marriage of Rose and Scipio. And so I guess this person's wondering, how did you know that they were Black?
Well, Rose was sold. We have the record that Rose was purchased by Pearson, and he also purchased Scipio. So we know that those two people were Black. Prince and Ruth, I have some records somewhere that state that they were Black, and I know they had to be anyway because of their,
But you knew it from other sources.
Well, also they don't have any last names.
Okay, let's see. One more question here I thought was interesting. How often did you run across records of Indigenous people being enslaved?
Yes, I did occasionally. And actually that's a whole topic unto itself. And originally I was hoping that I was going to include a lot of that. The thing that was frustrating about that is that, okay, where can we start on this one? A lot of what I would find originally would be simply that so many were just rounded up and taken away. I mean, no names, nothing. I didn't have anything except group of people. If I do have someone that I know is enslaved and they are noted as Indigenous, I absolutely put them down and make a note that they are Indigenous. So I definitely have quite a few, not as many as you'd think. It's almost as if you had the white people, and then under the radar were the Black people, and then under the radar were the Indigenous enslaved people. So that got tricky. And a lot of times it got so hard. I couldn't really get a handle on, they weren't bought and sold in quite the same way. So, but if I do have something, I will note it and I keep it, and I do have it in the record.
Okay, so kind of you would say it did occur, it's just a lot harder to track.
It was harder to track because a lot of times it was just, there might be some kind of a skirmish, and so, and they were gathered up, and and then they were put on the ships and they were sent away. Because it's always hard to enslave somebody who's in their own territory. It's easier to control somebody when they are disconnected from everything they know. And if you're trying to enslave somebody, because originally a lot of the colonizers came over and says, oh, we got all these people, look at all this labor. But things didn't work out quite as planned. One, because we brought so many diseases, we killed 90% of the population. And secondly, then the others weren't necessarily willing to do what we were making them do. And so it actually got to the point where bringing in enslaved people from Africa directly or through the West Indies was a lot more cost effective, sadly to say.
Thanks for addressing that. I'm having, this is a very inquisitive crowd, which is wonderful. Okay. I love that. I thought this was interesting. Nathan is offering a little bit of advice to add to your research, saying that there's a lot available at wikitree.com, where there is something called the U.S. Black Heritage Project going on. So I'll go ahead and see that.
Yeah, but yeah, that's good. Yeah, thank you for reminding me.
Add that to the chat for everybody, in case anyone here is interested. And then I think that a lot of the questions are starting to be kind of specific about specific names and specific people. So I might direct folks to email you directly with those questions.
Oh, that would be absolutely fine. I would be happy to answer anything. And as I said, sometimes people end up providing me with more information that can clarify a picture, or maybe just in this last couple of weeks, I've had some in collaboration and found some people I hadn't heard of before. And I've also found some people recently that we couldn't find them in Maine, but we found them after they got off the ship in Canada. That was interesting.
That was interesting. Oh boy, I wish I could get to all these questions, but I do think we.
I wish you could too, because they sound good.
How many more questions are you up for? Maybe two more?
Oh, give me a couple, sure.
Okay, all right. Let's see. All right, here's some. Alice is in Schenectady, and says the first settlement in the Mohawk Valley was settled by the Dutch in the 1600s, and the documents record enslaved people beginning by the mid 1740s by the Dutch, Scotch, Irish owners. So the Dutch were involved in the slave trade.
Oh, yeah, very
And
much.
She's wanting to know, did you know if there were Dutch slavers trading in Maine?
In Maine, we didn't have as much of a Dutch influence here, but the Dutch were certainly involved in the slave trade. They very much, they were always down. I'm finding lots of records of them down along the coast of Ghana and Sierra Leone. So I would absolutely say they were absolutely totally up to their necks in the slave trade. But we didn't have that much of a Dutch influence here. But you did have it in New York, and it moved upstate. So wherever, because they were involved in it, wherever they went, they were bringing it with them.
Okay, ready for that. The last question. Fred and Mary understand at some point manumission was made illegal in Massachusetts to prevent old or crippled slaves becoming wards of the town. What do you know about that?
Okay. Yes, this actually did happen. And I had a great incident, a great case just recently that somebody they didn't, because they would become wards and they didn't want them to become wards. So they didn't want you to just simply work someone half to death. And then when they got to be old, to free them so that you didn't have to take care of them anymore. You were supposed to be responsible for them up until the end. So, and there actually was a case in Massachusetts where he died, the slave owner died, and I think some family member took him over, but then he died, and then he ended up in Maine, and we lost track of him. We couldn't, and someone was trying to get some of the other family members to help support this old gentleman that had been enslaved and had by the family for all his life. So yeah, it was a problem. They were trying to hold the families accountable. The way I understand, they were trying to hold the families accountable to take care of these people so they didn't become wards of the state or the city or the town. That was a problem. And I do know that after the Revolutionary War, when slavery was discontinued, that some people would go off and they say, okay, I'm going to go. And they'd leave their former enslavers, and then they would get someplace and they couldn't get established. They were warned out of town because they didn't want to support them. And they couldn't find any work, and it was just a very ugly situation there. So then they ended up going back to their enslavers and becoming serfs. So it was just very difficult. So, but yeah,
Really sounds as promising as freedom sounded in the first place, right?
Oh yeah. So you had one more?
I think we're going to close there because the rest of the
Okay.
questions I'm seeing seem pretty specific, and I'll invite people to send you an email at
Okay.
vanacarmona@gmail.com. And I want to thank you again so much, Vana. I think everybody really enjoyed it. I can tell based